Hello, and welcome to this evening's event, A Pluribus Unum, Complexities and Contradictions, the Mythical America. My name is Alan Katz. I'm the founder and the CEO of American Public Square, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us tonight for the second program in our Race and Identity series, which we are proud to co-host this evening with our partners at Newsweek. I would like to thank our program and sponsors, including Marnie and John Sherman, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, the William T. Kemper Foundation, PlexPod, William Jewell College, and Ogletree Deacons. During the program, we will welcome requested fact checks and questions for our panel. Please utilize the Q&A feature of Zoom or comment on the Facebook live stream to ask questions or request a fact check. Allison Kelsler, APS Student Initiative Coordinator, will serve as tonight's fact checker. Batya Ungar-Sargon, Deputy Opinion Editor at Newsweek, will be our roving reporter for the evening. Batya will be asking questions submitted by our audience. With that, I will turn over to our moderator for this evening, David Von Drehle, columnist for the Washington Post. David?
Good evening, and thank you, Alan. It's lovely to be here to discuss a very important topic through this wonderful format that you've developed for American Public Square. E pluribus unum, out of the many, one, has been the unofficial motto of the United States of America since its inception in 1776. The phrase signified the central conflict animating the founders' mythic view of America.
Hello, and welcome to this evening's.
Are we on?
You're good, David.
Good, I'm sorry. The phrase e pluribus unum signified the central conflict animating the founders' mythic view of America as a place where organizing principles could bring a unity to a wonderfully diverse people. But of course, even then, this was more myth than reality. The rights enshrined by the founding fathers were only extended to white men, while chattel slavery meant that millions of Americans weren't even classified as fully human. What are we to make of the conflicting myths and memories that have animated our past and that we continue to debate here in our present? Are America's founding values now readily available to all Americans, or does the central conflict that once excluded so many people of color continue to define us now? And how does the insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th play into these questions? I'm pleased to welcome a panel tonight, all of whom I'm sure will have robust and varied and interesting viewpoints to help us find our way through this topic. Please welcome first Nancy Isenberg. Nancy is a history professor at Louisiana State University and the author of the New York Times bestseller, White Trash. Excellent book. Nancy's also a regular contributor at salon.com. Next, we have Bakari Sellers. Bakari made history in 2006 when, as a 22-year-old, he defeated a 26-year incumbent state representative to become the youngest member of the South Carolina state legislature and the youngest African-American elected official in the entire country. Mr. Sellers is the author of New York Times bestseller, My Vanishing Country. And you may have seen him in his frequent appearances on CNN as a political commentator. Next, Brian LeBeau. Professor LeBeau retired as provost and vice president for academic affairs at the University of St. Mary and currently serves as adjunct professor of history at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and at Georgetown University. And finally, we have David Brog. David is the executive director of the Maccabee Task Force, president of the Edmund Burke Foundation, and chairman of the Emergency Committee for America. Our viewers can find full bios of all the participants on the American Public Square event webpage. To all of the panelists, welcome. I'd like to start with Brian, one of our historians on the panel. From your research into the field of public memory and contested myth in American history, what can you tell us to sort of frame the conversation about the importance of founding myths to the creation of nations, and perhaps the role of E pluribus unum as an American motto?
Sure, thank you, David. Even after having taught and researched and written about public memory for many years, I was still struck, which takes me to the conversation tonight, by the seeming contradictions during the January 6th event, to put it mildly, where there were certain contradictions, notable contradictions that perhaps some didn't pay attention to unless you were, well, let's say, concerned with issues of public memory. And by that, I'm referring specifically to the comments, mostly of government officials, certainly members of Congress who were on the front line on this, that this is not who we are. This is entirely un-American. This does not reflect the true America, and other statements along the same lines. And then listening to those who were involved in, shall we call it an insurrection for the moment? Maybe we can go and talk a little bit more about that toward the end of our presentation. Their comments were, we want our country back. Stop the steal. You won't replace us. By the way, that was made famous during the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, if you remember. The government did this to us. We are the patriots. I found that striking, the difference in their opinions, and certainly got me to thinking about, what are we dealing with here? Such comments are not uncommon in American history, even down to contemporary period, but still, how did this contradiction reflect our understanding of public memory? And that sent me back to look at probably the founding book, really the most important book still in terms of imagined community, which is really what we're talking about. And that was by Benedict Anderson, and the title of a book by that very name, Imagined Communities, a book that really spawned shelves of responses in other books and have led the conversation ever since. Really aimed at those nations that were not founded any longer on what we call blood and soil, but rather having to create an imagined community if in fact they were going to survive as a nation. Anderson, I should make clear, does not focus exclusively on the United States. In fact, it's a really minor part. He assumes a lot about our knowledge of the United States, but clearly from what he's saying and what others looked at in the same vein, the United States serves as a poster child for this imagined community idea. As its founding, unlike many of the established nations in 1776, we were already one of the most diverse nations in the world by national origin, by religion, even by race, something that we don't ordinarily think about, that in the census of 1790, for example, 20% of Americans were African American, which is one of the largest percentages of ethnicity and race in the country at that point. Now, I should mention that the reason why Anderson did not focus on the United States, he actually came out with 2 editions of the book, triggered by events that were happening and his need to go back and look at what he meant by imagined communities. The 1983 edition, really, I would say the post-colonial edition, where he talked about those movements going on in Africa and Asia, forming new nations and the ability how those communities reflected the imagined community idea. And then a revised edition in 2006 where he was looking at the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the countries that were formed in Eastern Europe. And again, asking the same questions and looking at the cultural roots, if you will, of this imagined community. I should mention before I pass on it, and I don't want to leave the impression that he was a champion of all imagined communities. In fact, he was quite critical of several imagined communities by his saying that they were imagined and that they were product of cultural roots does not necessarily mean that they were positive. In fact, he allowed that some imagined communities at that time were exclusive of individuals and even were racist. He said that being imagined doesn't necessarily leave those things out, which of course resonates with the comments that David just made about the United States in 1976. I'll comment briefly on David's introduction of E Pluribus Unum. I thought I should do that because it's part of our title for tonight. It's important to understand that although and he was correct in saying it was the unofficial motto because it was never officially adopted as the motto of the United States. And it was also accompanied by other phrases that I think are really interesting. You put them together and you get a different impression as to what that E Pluribus Unum might have meant. And by that, I mean Novarum Seclorum, which is on your currency, which means a new order for the ages. Then Annuit Septus, again, by implication, he approves the undertaking. Now you put those three phrases together, E Pluribus Unum, out of many, one, and then he approves our undertaking and a new order for the ages. And you really get an interesting, much more complex message about, if you will, the founding myth. You put all those together. Are they prescribing? Are they reflecting what they actually believe? Were they hopeful that this might turn out to be a nation successful? And I'm really reminded in that context of Ben Franklin's, I think, apocryphal statement as he was coming out from the creation of the US Constitution, when supposedly some lady came up to him and said, well, what kind of government do we have, Dr. Franklin? And Benjamin, in his usual wit, said, my dear lady, you now have a republic if you can keep it. Okay, and I think that reflects in many ways what the feeling was about the founding of the nation. And only, this is something that, you know, many of the founding fathers were very concerned about. We were already a badly divided nation in 1776. And within 3 years after the nation got started, starting in 1791, we had a rebellion already in Western Pennsylvania, and Washington and Alexander Hamilton had to call out an army to go suppress it of something like 15,000 troops. So already we were in the thick of it, if you will, of trying to maintain the founding myth, if you will, or the imagined community of the United States. But let me just end with a reference to obviously the elephant in the room here, which is if we have a founding myth, it's probably in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And I just want you to remind you, the listeners, especially and viewers, of the two ideas, because we seldom mark the second idea as part of this founding myth. Let me read the first part and then the second part. The first one that everyone knows. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, fair enough, out there all the time. But listen to the second part of that, the very next sentence, and think of what happened on 1/6. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem more likely to affect the safety and happiness of the nation. It's a twofold message, no doubt about it. The second is sometimes buried. We prefer not to bring it up, but certainly we see it for real on January 6th. David? Back to you.
That's a wonderful start and a provocative place to bring us out. But Nancy, could you talk a little bit about what some of the meanings of this motto have been through time, through American history? Because it's shifted, it's taken different forms, it's meant different things to different people.
Yeah, I'd like to add that even Thomas Jefferson used blood references when he wrote about Virginia and used that as justification for revolution. He said that so much blood had been shed by colonial Virginians that kind of was a unifying metaphor. So that also, imagined also borrows repeatedly. This is one of my arguments. We borrow from Europe, we borrow from England in order to define who we are. We don't just invent things out of thin air. But what's interesting about E pluribus unum is that when it was first used, this is classic Franklin. Franklin essentially borrowed the motto from the Gentleman's Magazine, an English publication, to serve his purposes. So, and if you go through the founders' papers, they don't refer to it. It's not a major theme for them. It ended up being on the first carpet of the Senate's floor. But in many ways, it meant something completely different to the founders. It actually referred to the idea of states. It was the states that were the many. And they were not thinking, as it has come to mean, about the many representing all people. They didn't even imagine it as serving that purpose. The other thing is that the meaning changes. One of the most interesting, I think, reactions was Ulysses S. Grant. In the Civil War, he basically used the phrase to criticize states' rights. To basically challenge the idea that the states are not unum. And that's in his personal papers. We also know that Mark Twain, for example, in Huckleberry Finn, mocked the phrase. He basically connected it and made fun of the phrase and sort of called it pluribus unum mumps, essentially mocking the idea of Latin phrases, Latin mottos. And I think that was a kind of populist response on his part, because by 1885, most Americans, and even at the time the motto was being used in the early 18th century, only the elites knew Latin. So that's Mark Twain's. But I think one of the most interesting reactions to the phrase is a writing that we may not be as familiar with. And that was the writing of John Steinbeck. And this is in the last publication, the last thing he wrote, which was called America and the Americans. And this came out in the 1960s. And he was struggling. I felt that his words, in going back to this, that his words are reflecting what we're feeling today. Basically, he was despairing over America, despairing over the division. And he basically described America as a paradox. He said it was complicated, bullheaded, cruel, but unspeakably dear. And then when he got to the motto itself, he's made a really interesting comment. He basically said that the motto was strange and almost an unbelievable truth. And he went on to say, reminding us that the whole quest for greatness, and this is often why we have mottos, this is often the patriotism that's attached to these mottos. He went on to say that what Americans have to come to terms with is basically our very faults, our fault lines, our faults, and that until we face up to those faults and understand those divisions and not mask them behind rhetoric or mottos, we're truly not going to be able to understand our circumstances, our history, and to sort of come to terms with the fact that we have historically been a very divided people.
I think that's wonderful. One of the things in thinking and writing about the motto that has struck me is that some people, for some people, the emphasis is on the many, the pluribus, the diversity, the variety of Americans coming together. For other people, the emphasis is on the unum, the one, that you leave your diversity in a sense behind if you want to come and join the unit, the union, the one. David, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the meaning of both the motto and the unum, the nation, to you. How do you see this playing out in today's political conversation?
Well, to me, I view the American nation, the idea of an American nationalism, as a great hope during a time like this. We're being pulled apart. We were discussing this with Alan before the call started, but this is a time when all of a sudden, if you disagree with me politically, it's not a conversation for the sake of our shared future, a conversation among a beloved community. You're evil if you disagree with me. You're illegitimate if you disagree with me. We're divided by ideas, by politics, and there are people pulling us apart by race on both the far right and the far left. What's the glue that can hold us together? And I come back to the only glue that can hold us together as American citizens is the fact that we share something deep and profound, which is the shared American citizenship. And it's a recognition that our fates are intertwined. Our futures are intertwined, and we should relate to it as a deep, profound, I would say mystical bond. And we shouldn't look at our fellow American as a member of some other community, but as our fellow American. And because of that, we should be willing to overlook these superficial, silly differences of race and ethnicity. And because we share this bond, we should be willing to sacrifice for one another. I think quickly, 2 reasons why people hearing this might say, oh, that's, unrealistic dream. I would say 2 things. First of all, this idea of being an American citizen and this citizenship being so important to me that I'm willing to sacrifice for it has been the driving identity throughout most of our history. We have patriot graves lined with those who've made the supreme sacrifice for the sake of this nation and this identity. The good fortune of all of us today is we're not necessarily called upon to sacrifice our lives for this nation and this citizenship. But is it too much to ask that we love one another for the sake of this nation and for the sake of this citizenship? It's a far less serious sacrifice. And it's one I think we're capable of. And then finally, I think what's in fashion today is say, well, wait a minute. This nation that we're supposed to love, this nation that we're supposed to care about is imperfect. It's imperfect. So how can we love anything that's imperfect? How can we love anything that has a history of sin as well as virtue? And of course, that's life. That's humanity. The beautiful thing about E Pluribus Unum, the beautiful thing about what the founders did was not that we achieved it immediately. The beautiful thing I think about the American story is that we set the highest of ideals for ourselves and slowly, belatedly, gradually, at a high price in blood and pain, have lived up to these high ideals. This to me is a profoundly beautiful thing. And of course, it's a view shared by so many. It's a story not only of the founders, but of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War and fulfilling the promise partially by abolishing slavery. But then it's the story of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. described beautifully these great ideals in our founding as a promissory note. And he came to cash in on that promissory note. And he helped further us along these lines towards living up to these high ideals. Are we there yet? Of course not. Will we ever get there? No, we're never going to be perfect. But it's a story of steady progress. And when you look at the reality, not some imagined perfection, but of the reality of this world, I think it's a beautiful story of progress, of triumph. And therefore, I think we can be proud of being Americans. We can be proud of connecting with this land and its culture and its history. And we should, in this pride, see everyone else engaged in this mission as a brother, as someone with whom we share a deep mystical bond. And we should calm down and relax a little bit about the silly differences that might otherwise divide us. Too much at stake, too many problems in this fallen, troubled world if we can come together around these ideas and continue this story of progress, we do something beautiful, not only for ourselves here at home, we can continue to be an example. You know, Lincoln's words, the last best hope for humankind, and something I take seriously, and something I believe in.
Well, thank you for that clearly heartfelt statement. Bakari, I wonder if you could maybe reflect on how that story of steady progress and the idea of silly differences feels from your perspective, from a person whose heritage was not part of the original Unum, and has a person who
Black
I
person.
was around when Martin Luther King was asking, I mean, for the promissory note. You weren't. You probably weren't even born then. And so talk to us about that from your perspective.
So yeah, there's a few things. First, I'm from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina, where we have 3 stoplights and a blinking light. And my mom and dad always taught me the 2 most important words in the English language were the words "thank you," and they're not nearly said enough. And so to Alan and everybody at American Public Square and everybody spending time watching us tonight, and my fellow panelists and moderator, just thank you for having me here tonight. When I think about the phrase, when I think about our topic for discussion, I think that great irony and my fellow panelists who discussed it is we did it without the context of what was going on in the world around it. We talked about the one, we talked about the many, but we failed to realize that when this was written, as was our founding documents, there were people here in bondage. There were people brought against their will. There were people who were raped and pillaged. There were people who were sold as currency. There were people who were brought into the battery of Charleston and then sent to the islands, James and John's Island, to be fattened up and shined up so they could come back and be sold. They were ripped away from their families. And that was the backdrop for these documents. That was the backdrop for these Latin phrases that we're discussing tonight. That's the history of our country, for better or worse. I think that anybody who tells you that we haven't made progress in this country is just intellectually dishonest and a liar. I mean, that's just probably the best way to put it. We've made a great deal of progress, but I think that oftentimes we underestimate how far we have to go. I chuckle when people quote King during discussions such as this, because people have a unique memory of King that's not based in reality. King had an approval rating in 1964. His last Gallup approval rating was about 32%, less than Donald Trump's was at any given time. People fail to realize that King was a radical revolutionary. He was actually murdered in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was fighting for the rights and wages of sanitation workers. So King was someone who is often remembered differently in conversations and lifted up differently in conversations such as these, when he wasn't remembered by Black and white folk at that time, to be completely honest with you, or, as anything other than that radical revolutionary that he was. So I think it's important that we make that historical correction and note. And the last thing is, I just have a different version of what America should look like. Personally, I'm someone who loves this country. The blood of my family runs through the soil of this great country. My father was shot February 8th, 1968 in the Orangeburg Massacre by law enforcement after protesting a segregated all-white bowling alley. My father went to prison because he believed in what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, pushing this country to be better. That's what the civil rights movement was about. That's what the women's suffrage movement was about. That's what the gay rights movement was about, pushing our country to be better. And so, no, I don't want to live in a country where we see race as a petty difference. I don't want to look in a country where we are colorblind. I want you to see me for all the value of the diversity that I bring. I want you to see me, and you can say, oh, you weren't even born when he said the promissory note. That may be true, but that doesn't mean that my mother wasn't a part of the desegregating class of Hamilton High School That doesn't mean that my father didn't go through segregated schools. That doesn't mean that, you know, our family didn't suffer like many other people of color throughout this country. And I think that when you're gauging progress, excuse me, which is what we're kind of doing from that document, from that phrase, when you are gauging the progress we've made in this country, I think that when you talk about the fact that we have made progress, but we still have yet a ways to go, I think it's important that we understand in 55, you had Emmett Till, and during this time we have George Floyd. In the early 60s, you had the 16th Street Baptist Church. I lived through my good friend Clemente Pinckney and 8 others being murdered in a church in Charleston. You know, you had the Orangeburg Massacre, you have other incidents today, you have an insurrection. And so I want people to keep in perspective that we still have so far to go in this country. And I think that that is the promise. And I think that looking at this as an imperfect union, one that we love, only makes us work that much harder and more dedicated to the struggle of making it fulfill its promises to us all. Now, the hardest part about this discussion is that I wasn't written into it. And so I'm trying to make this country live up to a promise that wasn't made to me. And I feel that that's my obligation because, again, this is the country I love. This is what I believe in. I want to reimagine what it looks like because I have children that I want to leave this country in a better state than the one I inherited.
Well, thank you. And I do want to say that the only thing I meant by saying that you weren't born when that promissory note was carried to Washington was that it might seem like a pretty long time ago that the bill was laid down for collection, and it hasn't been fully paid.
Let me also mention this, David. It's something that I wrote down and I forgot to mention it as well. Because we live in a time right now where I think over the last 4 years, particularly in this January, this was the clearest example. We live in a place right now where people confuse their prejudice with patriotism.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is probably one of the most profound realizations I've come to recently. And the fact that every ounce of political progress we've made in this country has costed Black folk in particular the highest price.
Yeah.
You would not have the 64 and 65 Voting Rights Act if you did not have the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where people were able to see the bludgeoning and the fire hoses. You would not have the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but for the assassination of Martin Luther King. Hell, we wouldn't have taken the Confederate flag down in South Carolina, but for the deaths in Mother Emanuel AME Church. And so I want people to remember, as we're talking about sacrifices to move this country forward, yes, we have those sacrifices. And Lincoln, and we're quoting Lincoln a lot, which is cool with me. You got these individuals who paid the last full measure of devotion, to quote Lincoln again. I want us to remember that a lot of those people in this country were people of color who helped push the envelope forward so we could get to that goal of a more perfect union.
Absolutely.
Can I say a quick word, David?
Yeah.
I think in a sense what Bakari has set forth is actually quite a similar view to mine, maybe a different analysis of how far the progress has gone, maybe a different analysis of how much work is left to do. But two things, he's right about Martin Luther King Jr. But apologies, he's become an American icon. And I think it's a sign of our progress that he's gone from an unpopular figure to a very popular figure. That to me is a very good thing. It shows our progress as a country, that this man who is forcing us to live up to our ideals has gone from an enemy to a hero. And I think that's an important thing. And so you might laugh, but he's someone who's been extremely important in my life ever since I was a young child, ever since my parents held him up to me as an example of what made this country great. So it's personal to you and your community, but it's also personal, I think, to every American to a certain extent, if I may. And then the only other point I wanted to make is the view I take and the view Bakari set forth is a view that says this country was born in sin, continues to be flawed, but, and if I'm mischaracterizing you, I apologize, I know you'll correct me, but that the path forward is to build on this history of progress, on this foundation of American history and American ideals, not to reject America and the American ideals and the American system as irretrievably sinful or irretrievably flawed. And to that extent, I think we're actually partners in an extremely important mission and drama, partners, I think, who can work together and learn a lot from one another.
Can I add something? I just want to reiterate that, I mean, Martin Luther King, you know, the People's Party, he also, People's Movement, he also kind of connected racial oppression with class oppression. And part of the problem with our myth making is it's what we remember about what people do. And I think that, you know, this is true. I teach a course called America's Founding Myths, which is each generation reappropriates people from the past and shapes them to reflect what their political agendas are. That's part of what happens with history. And we know what happens. The other thing that I just want to emphasize is that when we think about who was left out of that social contract at the beginning, women were let out of that social contract. Women were, in a sense, were only defined as married women, and married women were seen as held under coverture and seen as subordinate to men, and they weren't given the right to vote. So we, you know, it always becomes very difficult when we try to imagine the past and realize that you know, society at the time of the founding, in a sense, was very hierarchical. It, in a sense, did not ratify equality as we even come close to what we imagine or what we even want, whatever we aspire to. And that's part of the danger, is that each generation kind of has its generalized conventional assumptions, its beliefs that they think are true. And then later generations can look back and sort of say, well, how could those people possibly believe those things? This is always, you know, this is sort of the root of the problem. And in fact, part of the reason that the mob on January 6th, to me, we have to remember that we have a long tradition of mobs in American history. Over 1,000 people died in riots and mobs before the Civil War. And we've had a variety of different kinds of mobs. We've had anti-Catholic mobs, we've had anti-abolitionist mobs, and then we've had race riots. And we've had this long tradition of violence. And guess what? Many of these mobs all use the same rationale, that they were the sovereign people. So this is the dangers. This is the thing we have to come to grips with, that they use the language of democracy. And I teach this in another class. I teach the film Fritz Lang's Fury. I teach the fact that democracy, when we empower the people, often that is used to rationalize violence. So I'm sorry, I don't want to be a downer here, but I also want some kind of reminder that the past is fraught with many things that we often don't want to confront. And that we have to realize that as a women's historian as well, that we do make progress, then there's often backlash. We still don't have an ERA. Ask me why. But I want to kind of, I'm going to be the more cynical person on this panel, but I also want to sort of us to take stock that that idea of unity at the time of the founding was just something fundamentally different from how we think about it or how we want to use it today.
The thing that strikes me is that about the folks in the rioting in the Capitol in January and the larger group that I think they represent is a very negative view of what David and Bakari are talking about as progress, and the idea that the more that membership and equality in the United States is extended to the more people it's given to, it has to be taken away from someone else. That an advance for Nancy or an advance for Bakari is coming at the expense of me or David or Brian or Alan. And that to me is the tricky thing to get beyond that. I've often tried to argue, because I think it's just self-evidently true, that the old Confederacy has been the number one beneficiary of the civil rights movement. That if you look at a city like Atlanta, or even Montgomery and Birmingham, anywhere in the Deep South, and you see the economic progress, the vitality of these communities, the people and companies moving into Texas, into Florida, and all that, none of that would have happened if apartheid still existed in the United States. These are the great beneficiaries, and yet we operate with this zero-sum kind of approach, that anything someone else gets is going to come out of my hide at my expense, or going to serve to push me down. Nancy, you've written about that in your book. What's the way around that, though?
Yeah, it's the classic zero-sum game argument. And it has been used repeatedly throughout history, as if everything is a competition. There's a limited amount of resources, and that essentially granting one group power or rights or access to resources deprives from another group. But as we also know, that's been used by politicians over and over and over again. In the South, not surprisingly, Southern elite politicians, tried to get the attention off them, the people who really had power, and inspire violence and hatred and competition among people in the lower economic spectrum, people who were African Americans, people who were poor whites. This is also a very common and unfortunate strategy that politicians use. And the reason it works is because it taps into people's basic fears. And we just can't ignore the fact that our society has a lot of divisions. And the one that I wrote about is class divisions. I feel like Americans always want to pretend there are no class divisions. We imagine we left them behind after the revolution. Yeah, England has class. And in fact, people in England talk about class all the time. We're not very good at talking about class divisions. And it's a problem because class affects racial divisions. These two are not separate. They're very much intertwined. In my background, I was told that you needed to understand race, class, and gender and how they intersect. And we can't kind of understand the full picture unless we understand the three of those. And that's why when we looked at the issue of poor whites, slavery was connected to their oppression. This is something that James Oglethorpe realized in Georgia, where he kept slavery out when it was first founded. Basically, he said that slavery empowers a elite who monopolize all the land and monopolize all the power through owning slaves. So we have to, first of all, realize that these class divisions have not gone away. And even to this day, we tend to not want to talk about class. We tend to mask it when we talk about meritocracy and assume that's going to solve the problem, which it will not. And we also tend to dismiss the poor. The poor were also not part of that social contract. We mock the poor. We call them lazy. We blame them for not being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be Benjamin Franklin. So when we talk about, again, the collective, many, the poor are also not part of that contract. And I feel that if we don't pay attention to where power, and this gets back to the resource issue. Yes, we can talk about the 1%, and that's, I think, a problem too, because class relations operate at all levels of society. And those class tensions create competition. They also create political frictions that politicians take advantage of. So one of the things that I have a problem with is when we imagine that America is still exceptional. We have less social mobility in this country today than many countries in Europe. We think at the founding, yes, we were different at the founding, but that doesn't mean we're different today. In fact, most middle class, upper middle class people give 50% of their wealth to their children, which is not true in other places like Denmark and countries where there is an effective social net and there's more social mobility. Harvard, for example, allows students with lower grades, but who come from more wealthy backgrounds into Harvard because they want to make sure they get the right alumni. It's not a meritocracy. There are privileges that elites have, they hold on to, they're not going to let them go. And then the best thing for the elites to do is distract people by, focusing on tensions between the lower classes and not talking about the whole system and how the whole system reflects inequality. And I think that's one of the things that we, as I said, I think we have a really difficult time talking about that. The fact that today, the largest group who are below the poverty line would classify themselves as white. And we have to sort of realize that that group is there. And we have to realize that they're not receiving the benefits that middle class white people have and upper class white people have. They're in a different position. And historically, they've always been in a different position. So we have to recognize that and not kind of pretend that somehow this is the land of opportunity.
One of the great things about American Public Square is the way audience is brought in. Our roving reporter, Batya, do we have questions from the audience that we should get in now?
Do have some questions from the audience, excuse me. So I'm going to start with a question for Bakari. One of the questions is, you mentioned that there is a problem of people confusing patriotism with racism and white supremacy. And the question is, how do we confront that? Where do we go from here?
I mean, how do we, that's an interesting question. I think that's what we're talking about. How do you confront, racism, white supremacy, the prejudices that we face? For me, I go back and I quote Stokely Carmichael, who said that if you want to lynch me, that's your problem. But if you have the power to lynch me, that's my problem. Because what we're talking we're talking about power constructs. You mentioned Oglethorpe, Nancy, which got me in the mind frame of Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Ben Tillman was the leader of the Red Shirts here in South Carolina. We know, I don't have to bore you all with the history of the KKK going underground and then the Red Shirts forming and the Red Shirts pushing back against any advancement that Negroes were making in the South. Uniquely enough, though, Pitchfork Ben Tillman created this thing called the Budget and Control Board in South Carolina, which is an entity that is made up of 5 different elected officials. It's the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate, the Treasurer, the Governor, and the Comptroller. Those are the 5 individuals. And the reason he did that is because, and it's the most powerful body in the state. And the reason he did that is because he did not want ever for there to be a time when a Negro could have absolute power in South Carolina. That Budget and Control Board is still in existence today. So we're not talking about remnants of a past time that is far, far away. I'm talking about something that still exists right now in terms of the structure and the overall governance of our state government. And so I'm someone.
Oh, okay. I just want to say, I could add an example from Louisiana. It's only recently, you were able to convict people of serious crimes without having a complete jury verdict. And that goes back to the Constitution in Louisiana. It was founded in the late 19th century. And again, for similar purposes. So, and this was only, was it a year ago, 2 years ago, maybe in the past year, that was changed, that was considered a violation of people's basic civil rights.
So the only reason I go there is I wanted to identify the oppressive legalities that we still face. And I wanted people to be able to understand how rooting it out looks to me. Like, it's not somebody calling you nigger. I mean, all you got to do is go to my Twitter page. I get, comments. I get that every day. But for me, it's tearing down or trying to identify why, in particularly, poor Black children go to school in corridors of shame, where their heating and air don't work, their infrastructure is falling apart, et cetera. why Black women, like my wife, nearly died during childbirth, but we know that Black women are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. Why we have these infrastructure issues. There are 100 cities in these United States that have less potable water than Flint, Michigan. The overarching majority are actually Native American and Black municipalities. So these are the tangible type of systemic issues. And I'm not going to even talk about our criminal justice system because we would be here on a whole nother, we'll be here a whole day talking about that. But these are some of the systemic ills that I want to root out and rebuild. And I use the term reimagine. I just think that is a better phrase politically in terms of messaging to get people on board. I want to reimagine the way we police in this country. I want to reimagine the way that we educate people in this country. I want to reimagine the way that we deliver healthcare in this country. And so that we have some modicum of equality in some areas where needed, and in some modicum of equity in some areas where needed. And I think that's how we root it out, through rooting out these systems and reimagining what they should look like. Now that's a heavy burden, but we can try.
Well,
Absolutely.
also I would say, think about education. I mean, in Louisiana, the solution has been privatization. And that means public schools are, again, not being financed, not being served. That's going to affect people who don't have the money to pay to go to private school, who can't pay to go to Catholic school. And this is kind of one of the points I want to make, is that elites, and this is something I see the Republican Party do, they frame it along this idea, they talk about liberty, they talk about, that people work hard to get ahead, and that we should reward the people who earn their keep. But even with something like poll taxes, let's look at the history of poll taxes. Poll taxes were used in the South to disenfranchise African Americans. They also ended up disenfranchising the poor, so that in 1924, less than 20% of the population voted in a presidential election in states that have poll taxes. So this is the other thing, that the kind of strange politics, the alliances that are made, that in a sense that can be racially motivated, but then they also have a class agenda that's built into them, and they end up punishing and being punitive to other people in society, even though the people in society may not know that. That's kind of part of what politicians do.
Allison, I want to bring you in. Another of the great traits of the American Public Square programming is that we fact check ourselves in real time. Anything that you want or need to flag that has been said so far?
Thank you, David, and thank you to the discussion being had by the panelists. I want to remind our audience that we do provide fact checks by request of the audience. However, I've taken it upon myself to provide some information on a comment that Professor Eisenberg said. I wanted to bring some context to and it's not a gotcha moment, Professor Eisenberg. It is just to bring some context to a term that was mentioned. She was talking about social mobility, and I wanted to provide clarity on the difference between social mobility and its relation to the term upward mobility. From Britannica, social mobility is referred to as the movement of individuals, families, or groups through a system of social hierarchy or stratification. If such mobility involves a change in position, especially in occupation, but no change in social class, it is called horizontal mobility, and thus therefore apply the same examples to upward mobility. An example would be an industrial worker who becomes a wealthy businessman, moves upward in the class system. A landed aristocrat who loses everything in a revolution moves downward in the system. I thought that could help provide some of the context on the term social mobility. Again, to request a fact check, you're going to do that the same way you are asking questions. Just simply signify that you're asking for a fact check, and I will provide a verification or some information to help support the claim. Thanks, David.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Brian in. You were giving a series of lectures at University of Missouri, Kansas City, just about the time that the riot at the Capitol took place. And I wonder if your thoughts about the militant right and its its place in our current politics was affected, or if you could just share with us what you were enlightening your listeners about at that time. Brian?
Making sure I'm unmuted, yep. It was not intended. It was pure coincidence that I did the course on white nationalism. It ended in mid-November, which was very timely for what happened in January. I wish we could have somehow continued the course after that. I think what I would have in the way of response to that in terms of what happened on January 6th and how it kind of affects our understanding of the right-wing militants. And I would like to start that off by saying, keep in mind that some of the most vicious and deadly riots in history were also started by the left. So I don't want to leave the impression that, all the violence that we've experienced in the country has been a right-wing movement, although clearly for the past, according to FBI statistics, for the past 4 years, over 90% of the acts of violence have come from the far right. So we need to be clear about that. I wasn't surprised at what happened on January 6th completely. I was alarmed by some of it, to be sure. Although I didn't, I should also say that although I was teaching it up to that point, I hope I didn't leave the students, or it was an audience beyond students, to have them believe that I saw it coming, that it was inevitable, although I sent up several warning notes along the way. I was not convinced that it was going to happen until practically the last minute. Let me just go over a couple of things that surprised me. Maybe that'll help answer your question. First of all, by not being surprised, in many ways, we were looking at a building toward this since the 1980s. This is not something that began even during the Trump years. This is something that has its roots in the backlash of the 1980s, and we can look at it in that regard. Secondly, I was not overly surprised, and I've been asked these questions repeatedly, by the size of the crowd. We've had much larger crowds, to be sure, over the years. And we look at the number of militant groups that were there. Again, that was not surprising. Various groups, the FBI, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and other groups have tracked, or are tracking currently, over 900 hate groups in the country. So that we had that number, which is really quite a bit smaller in Washington, was not surprising. That we know who they were, I think one of the most interesting things is everything's on tape, and they made no attempt to disguise themselves or to hide who they were. You could tell by their clothing, you could tell by their statements who they were, whether they were Oath Keepers or Three Percenters, or whether they were Proud Boys. They got most of the coverage, of course, whether they were Christian nationalists, whether they were cowboys for Trump. They were all there. They were read, and of course the QAnon flakes that don't bring anything in specific to the table. They just distrust anything, which made it all the more interesting to look at the groups. And of course, you look at things like Confederate flags in the Capitol, people wearing Auschwitz camp T-shirts. We knew who was there, although I would again bracket that by saying I still believe that the truly violent members of the crowd were a distinct minority. And I think that the vast majority of those there were there, and they sympathized, they agreed with some of the ideas that the militants brought to it, but they were not ready to exercise the degree of violence that went on. So there were no big surprises there. I mentioned earlier that I didn't anticipate the violence that occurred. The mob was clearly there. I would say when I began to tip in that direction was when Donald Trump and actually his son made even more blistering comments before he spoke. It was very clear in my mind when he said, we're going to march down to the Capitol, something was going to happen. I still anticipated that it would largely be a matter of a confrontation with the police, as was happened in several different clashes over the last couple of years. I didn't expect what happened in terms of the mobbing of the Capitol, but that I need to back up on that one and say I don't lay that completely at the feet of Donald Trump, although clearly he was igniting the fire in the powder keg that would lead to it. To a large extent, I think we're beginning to see it now if you've been watching the congressional hearings. Clearly, the door was practically open for them when the mob got there and there was such a pitiful defense force for the Capitol. If you have a group that's bent on pushing issues and then you have a group that's there to defend the Capitol with minimal involvement or opportunity, then I think you're opening the door to crisis at that point. But let me bring up one other point, if I might, very quickly, and I'd ask anyone who's interested to continue to follow up on this, is that I'm very interested. I'm always tracking who these groups are, and I was interested in a study that came out of the University of Chicago a couple weeks ago, the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. You might want to look up that report unless you really don't like mulling through data. But they looked at what they did is they analyzed 200 of the say the most violent members of those that stormed the Capitol, those that were arrested, and they got their records and their testimonies and so on to look at who they were, analyzed the project and compared them to those who had been arrested for the past 5 years for militant right-wing operation. They pretty much expected that they would be one and the same, that it would be the same groups. Now, again, focused on those who were directly involved in the militant activity, not the vast majority of people who, not to understate it, were there for the ride. But here's some of the difference that they discovered between the group that stormed and were arrested, but stormed the Capitol, and those previously arrested for militancy, is that, first of all, there was no questioning that this was purely a political violent act, that they were convinced that they were answering the president's call for action. No doubt they said it, they meant it, even though each of these groups that I mentioned earlier had different agendas. At that point, it didn't matter. They were there to defend Donald Trump and follow through on his calling. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And also you see when that failed, for example, the Proud Boys have now distanced themselves from Trump because of his backing off from his call to violence in the end. Other ones, unlike the test group, by test group, I mean those of the last 5 years versus the January 6ers, unlike the test group, the January 6ers had no previous very few previous connections with far-right groups, militias, white nationalists, and so on. Groups like the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and Oaths, they may have been there, but the vast majority of those that were arrested, only 10% had these kinds of ties with the militant right, versus the test group, which is the 5 years leading up to January 6th, 48, I don't want to exaggerate, 48%, we'll round it off to 50%, had such ties. Put another way, 89% of those arrested had no such militant ties that were there. Other things, the group on January 6th were older. The test group largely under 35, young, I would say at my age, younger people. Whereas 2/3 of the ones who were arrested on January 6th were over 35. Now, we don't know where all this is going in terms of how it will ultimately fall out, but interesting data. Whereas most of the test group, the pre-January 6th, were either blue collar or unemployed 40% of the January 6ers were either small business owners, they held white collar jobs, not necessarily at higher levels, And there were even a sprinkling in there of doctors, lawyers, elected officials, IT specialists, and accountants. This was a very different crowd. And perhaps I'll end with just one more, is that, well, two more. One, the January 6ers had very few previous arrests, even for minor crimes for that matter. They did have financial difficulties for the most part, in that some of them, because of their business connections, had bankruptcies and other kinds of issues that they had to deal with. But they didn't have the kinds of arrests that the test group, shall we say, had. And of course, you all know the thing that's made the most press is the high number of those among the January 6ers, of the pre-January 6 groups with their connection, and it did run over to an extent in the January 6 group, of their military and law enforcement connections in one way or another. Those were, the estimates go anywhere from 20 to 25% of the arrested group, okay, had those kinds of ties. And we can make the most of it as that really, and I mentioned earlier, that's the most alarming thing I saw of all the data that came out, and they're still analyzing the data. Usually when the military gets involved and law enforcement gets involved, you're edging toward that coup line that everyone's afraid is going to happen.
So I just want to jump in here because that actually dovetails very nicely into one of the questions we have. And this is for David Brogg. So we had a question. Someone says, I was confused when Mr. Brogg said silly political differences. I feel that the last 4 years were more of moral differences. How do we reach people who think that the last 4 years were okay? And then I want Bakari to respond after David answers. And I want Bakari to respond to yet another question where this person is saying, it seems to me that a lot of the conversation about the mythic America is about who gets to decide. Who gets to decide what is an unforgivable crime? Who gets to decide that someone's views are a threat to their very humanity? 1619 or 1776 is just as much a question of who as it is what or when. Do you agree? So if you two could take those questions and sort of kind of put them in conversation with each other, that would be great.
So, you know, the questioner, I think, is exhibiting some of the prominent thinking that's become very divisive in our society, so that we've gotten to the point where if you voted for Donald Trump, which, you know, half of America did, it's somehow inexcusable or something that cannot be excused. I would suggest we view it differently. I would suggest we say that we are people who share an ultimate goal, the perfection of our country, the success of our country, but who disagree as to policies and means of getting there. And a lot of what motivated people to vote for Donald Trump was not his personality, but his policies. And a lot of what drew people to Donald Trump may have been a certain way that he responded to what people feel was a delegitimization or a too strong a pushback from the left. We've gotten into this tit for tat dynamic of left attacking right, right responding by attacking left. And so I think if we're just going to view those who disagree with us as illegitimate, as people who we cannot fathom, it's going to be a lot harder to come together, to understand each other, and to move forward. I am certain if we got a group of Trump supporters and a group of Trump opponents in a room to discuss things as human beings, as individuals, in most cases, I think they would leave feeling closer to one another, understanding one another better than they did before they entered that room. Of course, that doesn't happen anymore in real life. And it doesn't happen very much digitally or virtually. We all live in our nice little silos. What's nice about this exercise tonight is it's a little intertwined. You know, for me, I draw the line at those who advocate or justify violence. That is something I cannot tolerate. That is something I cannot forgive. We saw it. We saw that violence on January 6th. To the credit of conservatives, with limited exceptions, it was universally condemned with exceptions. We've seen violence on the left as well. That's where I draw the line. Up until you advocate violence, you're still my brother. You're still my fellow citizen. We can still reason together what's the best path forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I want to respond to, and I'm trying to keep track in my head. I think I'm getting older with twins, so my memory is nowhere near is good. I used to be able to whip it back out pretty quick. So I want to start with Trump because I think that people have to go back a little bit further in their memories to understand how we got Trump. It wasn't just some weird aberration, some, kind of being that fell out and was this great politician who had this kind of political philosophy that people admire. I think we have to go back to Barack Obama, really, and somewhat of an overcorrection this country made in response to Barack Obama. We all know the stories about the late night events with Newt Gingrich and others saying we're going to make him a one-term president. Mitch McConnell, we know Mitch McConnell saying that he was going to do everything he could to make him a one-term president. We saw conservative media take off, Rush Limbaugh calling him Barack the Magic Negro. We saw and we know that Donald Trump's first foray for real into American politics in recent memory was trying to delegitimize Barack Obama's birth. He's still saying that many people are saying, and he has investigators out looking for his birth certificate. So that was his first foray into this national politics. I do think uniquely enough that he found a populist strain that wasn't just here in this country. We saw it also in Germany, although Angela Merkel was able to beat it back. We saw it with Brexit. We actually saw it with Hamas. Then they ran on a chicken in every pot. That was the biggest crock of BS we've ever seen in our life. They were the most unethical, cruel regime in probably the history of the world, but that's a whole nother discussion. But populism kind of, it didn't skip America. And we saw Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both kind of hit that theme. And at that time, just rise up. I think one of the things the media did and we did that also has not allowed us to have very good dialogue about this is that we believe in economic anxiety. And I think that's the greatest myth of our day because a lot of what we've seen has been cultural anxiety. I want to talk about January 6th just briefly before as I try to remember what the question was that was asked of me, because I kind of forgot what it was, the who question, who what question, and I can answer that pretty succinctly. But January 6th, Brian brought up the two things that I thought stuck out the most, to be honest with you. And January 6th in Charlottesville, I go around and I always ask a question to the audiences that are listening. I say, what's the greatest or the most what's the thing that stood out to you the most about these events, these uprisings, these insurrections, these violent acts? And everybody says, the rhetoric they were using, et cetera, et cetera. And I always say they didn't wear hoods. They didn't wear masks. See, that's the new part of this. Like racism wasn't just invented, but the fact that I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't cool being a racist, right? And now people actually walk around with no hoods on. They wear no mask. They chant slogans of anti-Semitism and bigotry, which brings me to my second point. I think that it's a very unique political and sociological experiment to see the nexus between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism, because this rally that you saw was a weird convergence of that. This rally that was, kind of the gas was Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump Jr. and Madison Cawthorn. You actually had Confederate flags in the Capitol next to people wearing 6 MWE, 6 million wasn't enough shirts. And I'm not an expert in the field of sociology to understand the patterns of behavior, but I do think that it's a very interesting thing that sticks out, that you see that nexus and you saw that underbelly, which is the worst of our country at that one moment in January 6th, and you saw it in Charlottesville. The question that was asked of me, and it goes back to how we discern, and it seems to be a question of who, and whether or not it's 1619 or 1776 or whatever it may be. I think I want to be clear on this point, because I think people are somewhat confused by what the ask is of this country. And I think at this point, maybe we can get something out of this dialogue if you understand what the ask is. For me, and for many people who are in the streets, for many people who are raising Black and brown children in this country, For many people who believe in the promise of this country, we only want one thing, which is the benefit of our humanity. That's the beginning and that's the end. The benefit of our humanity is all we ask. And the most sensationalized, raw example I can give you of us not getting that is George Floyd. George Floyd had a knee in the back of his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Nobody on this call, nobody watching this, nobody watching on Facebook or wherever you may be, knows someone who can treat another human being, let alone a dog, like that. And so what we're talking about is the fundamental benefit of our humanity in all aspects of life, not just interactions with law enforcement, but in the workplace, able to make a living wage, as Nancy talks about those nexuses. Although I do believe if we do have some economic mobility, we still have to deal with the issue of race, or else you end up with the issue like Philando Castile, who did absolutely everything right and still was gunned down by police. He actually had 42 contacts with police, which is absurd. And so if we talk about it from that lens of how do we make sure that we give individuals who may not look like us, love like us, pray like us, but who still love this country, the benefit of their humanity. I think if we start from that premise, then we don't have to worry about the who is telling the story, what reflection that we're looking at from that time period. We can go back and look in 1619. We can go back and look in, 1876, which was the last time an African-American was elected in South Carolina statewide prior to 2014 when Tim Scott was elected. That's a long time. That's over 100 years it took for a Black person to be elected statewide in a state that has the second highest Black population. Don't fact check me, Allison. I believe it's second behind Mississippi, maybe third, but I'm pretty sure we're in the top 3 or 4. So I want people to understand throughout history that should be your guiding judge. Whether or not people, cultures, ethnicity, human beings got the benefit of their humanity, point period. And then you can move on. And if they did not, then we can't say turn the page and heal. That's what drives me crazy about these conversations, because everybody want to say January 6th happened. Let's heal. Let's sing Kumbaya. No, we got to have some accountability. Black folk always got to forgive. We're not going to forgive. We got to have accountability, and we have to have atonement. That's what the scripture teaches me. You never get forgiveness without atonement. And we have to go through that as a country, and people always want to skip that step.
Yeah, can I add something? I'd like to say that Trump's personality had a lot to do with it. And this is based on political science research, that people often don't vote in their self-interest. People often vote maybe on one issue. And I think that his whole personality was wrapped up in everything. The Stop the Steal was about defending his honor. It was basically turning the vice president into a traitor. Essentially, this is the one thing, unfortunately, Trump was good at, and this is where he is like the Southern populists of the late 19th century, that it was all about his personality, that it was all about his performance. It was all about him appealing and pretending to have a connection with these people who felt some kind of grievance. So, David, I know you're more of an optimist, and I always like to say I agree with you on the internet. This is why I like John Adams' idea of the town meeting. I think it would be much healthier if people did meet face to face and had to talk to people. I think that they would find more common ground. But I also think we live in a world where people like Donald Trump, the reality TV star, can rule the roost because of the manipulation of his visual image, his cultural capital. And that's what I agree. I think it's not just about economic grievance. As Bakari mentioned, it's about manipulating, controlling cultural and symbolic capital. And what was playing out, I think, on January 6th.
Yeah, let me just add to that. It's not just political scientists, but historians as well. If you look back at, 200 plus years of history, there's been an insurrection of sorts every generation. And there's always been an undercurrent of individuals who are unhappy, perhaps for good reason, for the position that they are, the cards they have been dealt, in the hands that they're playing in this particular game. But it almost always takes one of two things to set it off. One is, as you've already mentioned, which is the person who will light the fire, who will light the fuse, like a Donald Trump, and there are others. We know the demagogues. We talked about Huey Long earlier, but people like that. But also it could be an event. It could be a secession or something like that that brings about, or it could be a war when New England threatened to secede from the Union in 1814. So that can happen as well. But you're absolutely right. These things just don't happen out of any, there's always the undercurrent that something needs to start the fire.
I just want to add one thing. I think there's a tendency to oversimplify groups and attribute, broad attributes to diverse groups. Trump voters are actually a diverse group,
Yeah.
Filled with different people. So you're right. His personality was an appeal to some. His extreme statements on Twitter and elsewhere were an appeal to some. But I think to many others, his policies were part of it. His general approach to America, of loving this country, make America great again, appealed to some. And just a final thought, there are many, I think, well-meaning people in this country who feel all of a sudden that they're being delegitimized for holding certain old-fashioned views. People of faith who all of a sudden feel that their Bible-based faith is no longer acceptable, is actually a great crime of intolerance in this country. And these people also saw an outlet in Donald Trump. I don't think we do a great service to coming together if we delegitimize every aspect of what made the man attractive to half the country. And so it's a complex picture.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to, what I'm trying to say is the people who came to the mob, and that the other thing that's, I think, to me, that's most disturbing is how people said it was the best day of their lives. The fact that these are people who basically feel this was the high point, and they were responding to Donald Trump's appeal. And I'm not speaking across the board for all Trump supporters. There are mixed motives why people vote, because a lot of them voted the party line. And they would have voted for anybody who was the Republican. That's true. And that might be more policy based. But for January 6th, Trump, as in everything he did, was at the center, the center of attention. And I think he is very much in the tradition of certain populist figures and how they make it about themselves. And then he kept saying how much he loved those people. That bond, that kind of sharing of his symbolic capital, making them feel important for this one day. This is a common pattern in mobs, unfortunately. People for that one moment feel there's somebody, and then suddenly the truth seeps in and they're not. So I think, yes, I agree with you. There are mixed motives. We have to kind of not reduce people to a box, but we have to realize I'm in this incident, I do think Trump was very much at the center of it.
And that, the violence we saw on January 6th, I would say is not representative of the large majority, much like some of the violence we saw over the summer is not necessarily representative of the large majority on the left. Just one final point I wanted to make. Bakari, I love the way you set forth sort of this vision. Just all we ask is that our full humanity be recognized, I think is how you phrased it. I think that's right. That's got to be the goal for us as a country, to get there for every community in this country. But in the debate on how to get there, I think we could sometimes disagree. So, for example, an issue like defunding the police, is that ultimately going to be a benefit to communities who have suffered in the criminal justice system, or does it ultimately produce greater violence for those in the inner cities? I think that's still a legitimate debate we can have, even if we share that ultimate goal.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's legitimate. I mean, I think that, defunding the police is a horrible slogan. Democrats need to pay for better messengers. But the fact is, the policy ain't bad. In fact, most white folk who live in suburban America would agree with it too, that we have bloated police budgets across the country. My mom don't want to get rid of police. Nobody's saying that we're going to not have police departments. That's very few, but we do need to reallocate the money to spend. We all have police in our family who will tell you that the simple fact is they don't need to be showing up to mental health calls. We know that. And if we want to not have a police state, you want to know where, if you want me to show you a community where you spend more money on outside resources and you have fewer police involvement, or you have community policing, all I have to do is take you to any suburb in America and you'll be able to see the result of that. But I want to talk about Trump just a little bit briefly here, because I know that there's just one point that I have to recall for folk. And I'm a huge Hillary Clinton fan. She's a good friend of my family. I love her to death. But you can't talk about Trump in 2016 without talking about Hillary, from the fact that you had the two most disliked people in the history of American politics in terms of popularity. So that also is something that goes into this kind of gumbo that gave us Trump. And my good friend Ron Brownstein, with all due respect to everybody who's on this panel, nobody knows numbers better than Ron Brownstein, in my opinion. And Ron will tell you that the Republican Party is growing in places that are shrinking. You see them growing in many of the rural areas in the country that are shrinking, whereas you see Democrats growing in urban areas and those suburbs of those urban areas. I do think that we have to think about what, it's funny how people try to caricature the Democratic Party as being a party of the squad or whatever they may be. And that's just it's just funny to me, because it's like an intellectually dishonest, experiment that I dare not go down. It's like me saying that the Republican Party is the party of Marjorie Greene. Now she may be your biggest cheerleader, but I mean, that's not where we're going. I think the fact is, though, and what we have to remember is that Trump's legacy, the capstone of it, is January 6th. But he lost the House and the Senate during that time frame. And even more devastating to a Republican Party, because of the racism, bigotry, et cetera, and the demographic changes, is that they have only won 1 out of the last 8 presidential popular votes in this country. And whether or not you want to see the warning signs or see the fact that there is a blinking upside down turtle, I don't know what that symbol means, but a blinking upside down turtle on your dashboard or not, it's there. And I just think that we have to, it's not a we, I didn't make the bed, I don't have to lay in it, but we have to, if we want to have conversations, that has to be addressed by certain people who ascribe to those notions. As we were right at 8:30, sorry about that.
So we like to end these programs with what we call the so what, now what? So we give you each 60 seconds, just summarize where we are, like from your point of view, having had this conversation. So what, now what? The mythical America. Why don't we go Nancy, Brian, David, and then we'll end with Bakari. And thank you guys so much.
Can someone else go first?
Sure, let's do Brian, David, Nancy, Bakari.
Yeah, I'll go first once I unmute myself. Mine's a rather simple answer in that I think we need a founding myth. I think that's where we are at this point. I'm always balking at the use of the term myth because that carries with it a lot of baggage. So let me rephrase that and say I think we need an imagined community, something that has failed us over the years, or at least failed to serve us properly. I think an imagined community to work, and this is perhaps where I differ a little bit from most of the common understanding of myth, is that it can be aspirational. It doesn't have to be something that talks about the past or that talks about the present. In fact, probably the best imagined community would be so great that it would have to be inspirational or aspirational. I don't know how else we could survive as a nation. My concern is whether we can get there or not. Frankly, the last couple years have been very disturbing to me in that regard, especially when looking at the history. Although I'd like to be in David's camp and be as optimistic as I can that this may yet happen. The downside is, and recently read Amy Chu's book about tribalism, which is an excellent book. It's kind of a downer, to use Nancy's phrase earlier. It's be in a good mood when you read it, but it talks about how, really, to summarize and oversimplify, our default position is tribalism. When we get into difficulty, when we're in disagreement, we resort to our tribes, and that only makes it worse. If we have to avoid that, we have to become aspirational. We have to have, it seems to me, an imagined America, an imagined community if we're going to survive. If we don't, then not only will democracy collapse, but we will end up with a system far worse than, was it Churchill or someone said, the democracy may not be a great system, but it's the best we have. I really believe that, but unless we can get to that point where I just mentioned, it isn't going to happen. So let's say I'm cautiously optimistic, and then I'll defer to David to defend me on that one.
I have to agree with Brian. I haven't read Amy's book, but I think that's right. We have a default throughout history that goes down to the tribe. We value our tribe, and those from other tribes we value less. You know, throughout most civilizations and most of human history,
Right.
you weren't allowed to murder members of your own tribe, but those guys next door, that's fair game. That's why I think it's critical how we define the tribe in America today. And the tribe, I fear for a country in which the tribe is white people, the tribe is Black people. I want a tribe defined as America. We are all part of the same tribe. And when you see that lived, let's say in the United States Army, which has been more integrated than the country as a whole, you see a living bond where even if they've lost faith in the war they're fighting, they fight to defend one another. It's a profound bond. If you go to integrated churches where the focus isn't on the divisions, but the fact that we're all children of God and fellow Americans, you see a love and a community that is not imagined. It is quite real and quite inspirational. I don't think it's too much to ask that we can get there in this country. We do have to acknowledge the sins of this country, the flaws of this country ongoing into the present day. And a lot of the focus of this call has been on these facts. And yet it's my assigned duty apparently to be the optimist. I do want to close on an optimistic note that despite it all, my 4 grandparents came to this country, dirt poor Jews, excluded from you might forget them. My parents couldn't get jobs in the big accounting firms, couldn't move into certain communities. I'm not making comparisons. I'm just saying that in this way, my 4 grandparents came here. My grandfather worked in a windowless sweatshop. Why? So his daughter could go to college. And my mom went to City College in New York. And my dad finished first in his class and was able to get a scholarship to college. And and again, no one would hire him when he got out, but he was able to go to college and start on his own. And so with all of our flaws, I feel like I've lived the American dream. And as Bakari said, you do have to be grateful when you're given a blessing. I feel that we were given a blessing to become citizens of this country. I know in my case, my family would have been ashes and dust if this country didn't let us in and give us what's approximated full equal citizenship. And to the extent others don't have it, we absolutely have to demand it. But when I look at the immigrants wanting to come in from Africa, from Asia, from all around this world, who still see this as the place they want to be, who still see this as the place where they want to work in that sweatshop so that their children can go to school, even with some of the depressing data you mentioned, Nancy, I think the dream is alive. And so while we focus on our flaws, when you love your family and when you love your community, then you do focus on your flaws and you're honest about it and you try to do better. But while doing that, I worry, let's not lose sight of our virtues, because if we lose sight of our virtues and our promise, then I fear for the next generation and whether they'll be able to maintain what to me has been a unique experiment in human history, and one that's done enormous good for enormous numbers of people, not just here at home, but abroad.
Yeah, I guess I'll go. I'll be brief. I'll try to stick to the 60-second timing that they gave us, Brian and David. I think the challenge that we have is that we, I hate to sound like a broken record, but you have to see me for everything I bring. I love this country just as much as anyone else, but I want you to love me for being a Black man in this country. I want you to love me from being a Black man in this country who has contributed, whose family has contributed and will continue to contribute, but understanding the sacrifices that were made and the pain that's gone through. I think it's too easy for this country and people, particularly white folk, to say, I just want to see you as American. Nope, you don't get that. I can't give you that. You can say that all you want, but that is just not That's not how we move forward. You have to see me and recognize me and those scars on my back and the whelps that we carry and the burdens that we carry. You have to see all of that. You and me, when you look in my eyes, you got to see George Floyd. When you look at my daughter, you got to see Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland. When you go home and kiss your kids, you have to recognize that you don't have to have a conversation with your child about whether or not they're going to come home and how they need to interact with law enforcement. And so we need to be able to have very real conversations in this country about how to move forward. And I think that one thing that we all recognize is that this is an imperfect union, but yes, it's not as if we're talking about something that's irredeemable. It's not as if we're talking about something that we haven't sacrificed for, we want to take advantage of. We want to contribute just as much as the next person to making it a more perfect union. I am very appreciative of the high level dialogue that I've had tonight with very smart people. I don't know if I have enough degrees or teaching experience to actually be on a panel like this, but I'm thankful that you all had me as a part of this August body, and look forward to further discussions down the road about how we move this country forward.
Yeah, well, as you've probably noticed, I see myself as a historian, and that's where I stay. That's my form of information. That's how I look at the world. And I have to say that because when I wrote White Trash, I was writing about people who had a very different experience from me. And part of what I worry about, the reason I probably am more skeptical about myths, is that I've studied them extensively and know that often myths conceal and subordinate certain groups. One of the basic problems with tropes is that it's about who can represent the whole and then who can only represent the part. And this is a trope that's been applied to women. Why do you think Hillary Clinton lost? Why do you think we haven't had a woman for president? That's not an accident. It's not only that people hated her, but gender had to do with that. So I think part of the myths is we need more than one. We can't have one myth. We can never have one unifying myth. And probably where I disagree with David is, or John Meacham, we talk about the soul of America. I'm very uncomfortable with that kind of religious language in a lot of ways, because I think it's trying to appeal to a civil religion. And I've studied that as well. I think I'm more comfortable with a more political definition of virtue and disinterestedness. And I wish that we would actually celebrate not just the winners in this country, but the people who do suffer, the people who are left out of the story, and not to penalize people. I mean, I totally agree with you. It's not helpful to just attack people and say that their perspective isn't legitimate and to silence them. I don't agree with that. But I also believe that it's very hard to come up with one myth that will accurately portray the history, because the history is messy, unpleasant. And with aspirations, I'm all for aspirations, but that's also very vague. and it's not about the concrete. And as somebody who studies class, material reality has to be part of the discussion, not just symbolism. And that's where it gets very personal for people, because then they do have to think about, well, what privileges do I have? What privileges do I have that can be because of my whiteness, can be because of my gender, can be because of my class position? And I think that coming to grasp with that is also has to be part of the debate when we try to define what it is to be an American. That we've always been divided, but we have to realize that certain divisions are still with us, not to bludgeon people for them being around, but to embrace them in understanding, greater open discussion about this. Town meetings is where we should be.
Thank you all so much for this amazing panel. It was truly, truly inspiring. And I also want to thank you not just for your brilliant comments, but for the moral courage that it takes to show up in a space where there are people that you disagree with. We're all about that at Newsweek, and we're all about that at American Public Square. And so thank you so much. And I'm just going to pass it along to Denisha to close us out.
So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our moderator. Thank you for our fact checker. And thank you to Batya for being our roving reporter for this evening. Just quickly, you all will get a survey tomorrow by email. Please fill out that survey and that will help us as we continue planning programming for the future. So I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you for joining us and good night.